was ambassador in 2008, 2013. For sure. We met some years ago. So you retired also.
Now we can invite here Mr. Lars Fredén, who can provide very different perspectives as a practitioner, diplomat, civil servant. Please come here.
Yeah, my name is Lars Fredén, and I've been asked to give a comment from the field. Yeah. Because I was during the time that we now discussed, which mostly concerned the period from 1991 to 94, during Karl's prime ministership and during the first years of independence, re-established independence of Estonia. I worked with Karl, and that was sort of his torpedo. And I'd like to say a few words about that, but I would also like to say something about the period before the re-establishment of independence. But I'll begin by some personal remarks, and to say that there was a question asked by the moderator, what did foreign diplomats teach you, or even Swedish diplomats? And I'd like to turn it around and say that I consider my time in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania as the only education that I have had of any importance. I think that it was to me, it taught me a great deal about diplomacy, about important things rather than unimportant things. And on a personal level, it taught me the value of understanding history, the value of one's language, the necessity of remembering, and the deep necessity of forgetting. So I consider the people that have spoken here today my teachers. It was a supreme privilege to be involved in these years. In my case, they started in '89, and they didn't really finish until 1998, when I left Moscow, because the Baltic issues was the main part of what we did there as well. And in fact, it didn't end until 2006, when I finally had finished the 2 books that I wrote about that period. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. I think that's very important. And I think that for foreign policy, Swedish foreign policy in general, and particularly Swedish security policy, I think that the fact that we were dealing with Baltic issues intensely, partly very intensely anyway, transformed Swedish security policy and foreign policy. It became more serious. I quite agree with Karl, and since I have retired myself from the Foreign Service, I can now, for the first time in about 35 years, say what I actually think. I think that before 98, Swedish foreign policy dealt with very faraway things. It was really positioning, it wasn't really policy. And here, with the independence movements in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, we were for the first time faced with a grown-up problem. A grown-up problem. It wasn't just intrinsically interesting. Many foreign policy issues are interesting. But it was also of utmost importance to us ourselves, to Swedes themselves, what the outcome would be. Self-interest. Karl has stated self-interest several times here, and I quite agree. I'd also like to say that there used to be in Sweden, there still is as a matter of fact, a deep conviction that Swedish neutrality, impartiality, makes us supremely suited to solve the world's problems. Yes, I actually said that. And of course, I was ironic, but I do believe that this was how I was trained when I joined the Foreign Service in 1982. But looking back at the preventive diplomacy that was conducted during Karl's time, conflict prevention, that's exactly what we were doing. I think that the fact that we were not impartial made us useful. Because all parties understood, Moscow understood, I think in this capital it was understood as well, and I know that it was understood in Washington. They knew that we had a, as they say in America, a dog in the fight. We were committed to getting this right, because getting it wrong would immediately have affected Swedish security policy. In my second book, which has been translated to Estonian, there's a final chapter about this. Maybe you have to be Swedish to realize how unusual it is to see the world in this fashion. Since most of the audience is not Swedish, I can go on to another point. The United States was mentioned. I think they are very well, they really need a great big thank you. And Karl mentioned Nick Burns, a formidable character, a great expert in the power politics of Washington. You can still hear about him now and then. He's now at the Harvard Kennedy School, I believe. He was also the spokesman for the State Department for quite a long time. And I think that he felt the pressure from Congress. I think that had it not been for the US Congress, the absorption of the administration with Russian affairs would not have allowed so much space for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as was in fact the case, and Nick picked that up. I'm proud to be one of the few Swedish citizens who's actually been in the Situation Room, the basement of the White House, on a particularly intense moment, supremely scheduled by Nick Burns. He was, as I say, a formidable operator. In this Joycean stream of consciousness in which I am now engaging, I'd also like to say that I think that, and Karl also mentioned this several times, I'd like to expand on that a little bit, that the preoccupation, I would even say, the energy spent on Estonian issues from about 1988 in the Swedish foreign policy establishment would not have happened if Sweden had not had the great fortune of housing or giving refuge to one of the most, perhaps, well, one of the most, maybe even the most successful diaspora, that immigrant community from the Swedish point of view that we have ever seen. It was also one of the first and biggest. The Estonian immigrants, refugees to Sweden, were in almost every case extremely successful. So that when this great movement of the Rahvarine and so on began, there was plenty of people inside the Swedish government machinery and also academia and also the military who spoke the language and who understood what the issues were. We have spoken about the fact that these were dangerous times. I remember it like that as well. They were also very busy times. In fact, when I look back, I can't remember very much because I was always extremely tired. I couldn't sleep very well. I was very stressed. That's why I wrote the books that I wrote, because I wanted to force myself to go through my papers and to see what actually happened as the papers said that they did. And for those of you, if there are any historians here, I donated my entire Baltic archive to the Swedish Riksarkivet, the government archives, where they will be available for anyone who wishes to see them in just a few years from now. These were dangerous times, yes. I'd just like to mention a few of the things that might have happened that did not happen. And to begin at a high level of abstraction. What could have happened was that the Russian troops left, but that Estonia had not achieved what it has achieved. Three things. One, a fairly secure security environment, which means building up your own armed forces, joining NATO and so on, successful economy, and a real democracy. If any of those three things had failed, the Swedish security situation would be entirely different. So in the days when I worked for Carl, we were intent on doing what we could to see that all of those three things happened. In the few minutes that I have left, I'd like to go back to the period before the period that has been discussed on the stage here, and to begin I would like to make myself the spokesman for absent friends who should have been here. One person was unable to come, another one has died, much too early. And to bring you back to how the Swedish Foreign Ministry saw the developments in the Baltic Sea area from about 1988, the beginning of Rachvarinne and the Singing Revolution and so on and so forth. And the person with whom all of this began is Thomas Bertelman, who is very much alive, living in Stockholm. And if there are any historians here, I think you should interview him. It so happened that Tallinn was part of the Soviet mandate for the Swedish Consulate General in Leningrad. So was Karelia, so was Riga, so was Vilnius, so was, as I recall, Liepaja, or maybe Ventspils. And therefore it was possible to travel here for Swedish diplomats. And in 1988, the Consul General in Leningrad retired, and Thomas Bertelman, who was the Sovietologist at the Swedish Foreign Ministry, was by design sent out to replace him, the Consul General in Leningrad, for 1 year. And Thomas is the one who traveled first from Swedish diplomats and wrote some sensational reports that are now all unclassified and deserve to be read, reporting on the Baltic Road and the early steps. After that, in the spring, around March, April 1989, Thomas, together with Hans Olsson, who left this world in spring of this year, much too early. He's younger than I am. He was younger than I am. And Hans Olsson was the responsible for the Soviet Union in the Swedish Foreign Ministry. And he remained the only person responsible for the Soviet Union in the Swedish ministry until August 1991, a rather absurd situation. There was one person doing economy, but on the political side, there was only one person at the Swedish Foreign Ministry, the desk officer. So he did Nagorno-Karabakh, Yeltsin's ascent, strikes in Donbass, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 11th of March 1990, one person. I mention this fact because it shows that in those years, before Carl so happily became Prime Minister, you notice, by the way, that Swedish elections varied perfectly with world history. We have that in mind when we changed our constitution. Where was I? Yes, Hans Olsson, yes. There wasn't really much, there was a lot of symbolic statements and some symbolic actions on the part of the Swedish Foreign Ministry. But out here on the terrain, we were spectacularly under-resourced. I myself almost collapsed. I kept driving on Volvo back and forth, Leningrad, Ivangorod, Narva, Kingisepp, I forgot, terrible Kingisepp, Tallinn, down to Riga and Vilnius, Panevėžys, all of those had a very unsound space, and twice I fell asleep at the wheel and woke up at the very last second. Otherwise I would not have been standing here today. Yes, Now, the immediate problem from this point of view of Swedish civil servants responsible for the Soviet Union was visas, issuing visas. I was sent out to Leningrad. I was recruited by Thomas Bertelman, I mentioned. I was recruited not because I was particularly well suited for that. I think my only qualification was that I was unmarried. Because it was clear that I would have no private life. And there weren't many of my type around, so Thomas selected me for this job. And I was placed in Leningrad with the express job description of traveling in the Baltic republics, as we call them. And visas became a reality as I looked out from my window. I lived in the Consulate General building on Vasilijski Ostrov. And the pavement outside the Consulate General was full of Soviet-made cars, Zhiguli. They looked like, well, there were hundreds of them. Well, 50 at least. And people, mainly Estonians, slept overnight in these cars. We had to wait several days, sometimes only to turn in a visa application to the Consulate General in Leningrad. The only place you could get a visa. You could also go to Moscow, of course. And so the immediate preoccupation was to see that visas were issued in Tallinn first, because the vast number of applications came from Estonia, and then came nothing, then came nothing, then came Latvia, and then came a great deal, and then came Lithuania. So I was then sent out to establish what became ENDLA 4A, and since we're celebrating the opening of ENDLA 4A on the December 11th, I'd just like to say a few words. One is that I'm not responsible for choosing that house. It's one of the ugliest buildings I've seen anywhere. And but it was negotiated by someone else who is not here, with Arnold Green, then Foreign Minister of the Estonian Soviet Republic. And a couple of days later I was told to make sure that we could write a contract for renting this place. I think I have always suspected it used to be, as you know, some sort of merchant marine school. And I suppose that it was well equipped, merchant marine being dominated by Russian Soviet interests, all things having to do with transportation. I'm sure that there were lots of microphones in that building. That's probably why it was given to us. And on, I think it was in October, I had a long negotiation with the head of the school and his blonde assistant. Real Sovietska blondinka. It was really kind of funny. That this is, I'd just like to mention this because much of policy at that time, all policy comes down to practical things. And in this case, how big and how do we pay for it? Of course, you couldn't turn over foreign money, they were not allowed to. So as a matter of fact, the first rent was paid. I'm exaggerating a little bit now, but after all, this is a remembering symposium. The first month was paid with a Xerox machine, which they required. And then the next question just a few days later was to find people to help us, translators, and of course the Swedish apparatus was not ready to send out experts on visas and so on. These had to be local staff supervised by Swedes. And in those days there was something called the Service Bureau. I can't recall what it was called in Russian. The whole system was that the Soviet Union gave you people who could be trusted from their point of view. And I decided this was not possible, so we put in a rather large ad in Swedish, being a self-selecting ad because only people who would be qualified could read the ad. And in fact, about 30 people turned up down at outside ENDLA 4A, late October. Coldish, a lot of traffic, as you know, out there. There were about 20 of them standing in line, and I counted them, and then I gave them numbers, and gave them an approximate time to turn up. ENDLA 4A was then empty. The rebuilding began, and so as I was doing, there was only one chair which I torch for me, and the recipients would sit on some building material that sort of formed a kind of bench, and as this went on, the builders were carrying stuff into the building. I selected a few, and then of course made a short list, and then the obvious realization came to me that maybe some sort of security check should be made. And you have to remember we had no secure communications. In fact, in Riga, which became my fate later, the code machine was established after August 91. And during the events in Riga, and there were several, and in Lithuania, there was no secure way to communicate with Stockholm, because people didn't really, well, enough. And someone said to me that there is this fellow Lennart Meri that you might ask about a few of these people. I don't quite remember how it was or who said so. I had met Lennart Meri once in the lunch room, coffee room of the Swedish Foreign Ministry early 1989. He was there on some sort of study tour for the Estonian Institute, which he was then in charge of. And I exchanged a few words with him, so at least I had a visual image of him. But I was told that one could trust Lennart Meri. I drove out in my Volvo 740, my private car, of course, to Nömme, where he had a villa. He looked at them, and before he looked at these names, he said, "You can speak openly here. I built the house myself. No microphones." And then he stopped at one of the names and he said, "I would avoid that one. It tends to run in families." And only later was it possible for me to get in touch with the Swedish counterintelligence, who could also exclude someone else, which we had almost employed. And then the actual activities began in December 11, and I'd like to recognize, as they say in Washington, I'd like to recognize here Håkan Damm, who is right there, and you can stand up, Håkan, if I say so, because the man who actually made the ENLA 4A operational, with all that it implies. It's not as easy as it sounds. It is in fact rather complex, very tiring. Is Håkan Damm, who ran the place until 91, isn't that right, Håkan? Yeah. Bon, I think I'll when we look at this period, I think we should also, when we look at the period before 91, I think one should signal that the Swedish Foreign Ministry and probably many other parts of the Swedish security apparatus took a long time to realize that the Soviet Union was about to disappear. Well, not so strange, because it was a big thing, couldn't just melt away. And in fact, the fact that it did disappear may have been also a great deal of luck. And so the outcome was not clear. But there was a lack of imagination, I think, in Stockholm, certainly in my mind as well. I'd like to mention here that I was trained at the Swedish military school for interpreters, Russian. I had seen the might of the Sovietsky Soyuz in lists and identification cards for various military equipment, and it was hard for me to understand that the Soviet Union will one day no longer exist. And I think that the visit by Sten Andersson, the then foreign minister, on the 8th of November, contributed to this, because, as was alluded to here on the stage, he got very bad press when he came home, because he had answered a question. Sten Andersson, är Estland ockuperat? There's a fellow from northern Sweden who asked a question, and he said, "Is Estonia occupied?" And he said, "No." And he probably said that because in his briefing papers he had been told that no, we do not see Estonia as occupied, we see it as annexed, which is even worse. But he shouldn't have taken that question, because he was not quite prepared for it. And after that, I think it was not a pleasant thing to be dealing with. The Swedish attitude, in my view, changed only after the violence in Vilnius, particularly in January '91. There was also shooting in Riga, in the park right outside the Oman building where the US embassy is now. I remember it well because I was together with about 100 other people taking cover behind a tree. And after that time it became clear that for moral reasons we simply had to have a more active policy. But nothing of this came down to resources in the ground, which is quite strange. Another two more points, I think, I'm going to make, maybe 1.5. Sweden, it has to do with the Swedish recognition of the occupation. This is very much discussed, but the consensus amongst people interested in international law is that Sweden must be considered to have accepted Stalin's annexation of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania through a series of actions, not a single action. And this is exactly why we could be here. Because if we had had a clearer non-recognition policy, as most Western countries did, we could not have established the offices here, because it would have meant that we had accepted the annexation at the worst possible time. It's an example of the paradox of life. A more, if you will allow me to give to wind this up with a few personal notes. My first trip to Tallinn was in 1975. As I said, I was trained at the Swedish Army Military School, and from 1971 I traveled through the Soviet Union because I wanted to see what the Soviet Union was like. And in the mid-70s I came to Tallinn for the first time, and also to Riga and also to Vilnius. And I will not pretend to have had a clearer view of world history than I did, but it did seem to me very strange that we didn't speak about this part of the Baltic Sea. I quite agree with Carl that Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania was forgotten or even actively pushed out of the discussion, and I found it then and I find it now retroactively shameful. The first person who pointed out to me that Estonia had once existed, very much so, and that it might be revived, was someone who has been mentioned here, Andres Kühn, also a graduate of the military school, whom I met. He's older than me, he was older than me. I met at one of our refresher courses. He had just written his book, Estland and Studie Imperialism, Estonia Study in Imperialism, and he gave it to me with the Andres Kühn-like enthusiasm, completely convinced that one day Estonia would re-establish its independence, which of course I could not believe at the time. If I continue, it will get worse.